Hello, I hope you're well. Today's short lesson is on democracy. First, we will be discussing the background of democracy, what democracy is, and what democracy looked like closer to its point of origination. Then we'll be discussing some of the types of democracy, specifically looking into representative and direct democracy. We'll take this into a real life example of democracy at play through a referendum, assessing how this fits into the United Kingdom through the EU referendum or the Brexit referendum and the Scottish independence referendum. Okay, so let's talk about what democracy is. So, democracy is a political theory that originated in ancient Greece. So, the Greek words demos and kratos mean people power. So, essentially, the idea behind democracy is to refute past political systems and past political systems that were feudalistic in nature and hierarchical, where one individual at the top of the society, usually a monarch or a dictator, had ultimate political decision making ability and had ultimate power in the society. So democracy has these two key features that refute that idea and say that there needs to be political participation. So the people need to be involved, or the stakeholders in the society need to be involved in the laws that govern that society. And political equality, all citizens in the society need to have a say in the laws. So if you look at this picture over here, it appears to be a senate, a senate in ancient Greece, and the people involved here are a group of eligible Athenian men, so eligible voters, parliamentarians, senators, Athenian men, usually over the age of 30, upper class, owning land. There were some mixes in classes, but slaves were left out of the political process. So automatically, what we can see here is that there needs to be a caveat added to demos. So it doesn't mean all people. So little asterisks there to remind you. Doesn't mean all people had the key tenets of the key features of democracy. So there were only so slaves, for instance, did not have political representation and most definitely did not have political equality. And men, so women were left out of this process. Uh, Upper class, apart from some mixes in classes. So there were you could look at a Athenian Senate and then and then and clearly see that most of the people, or a vast majority of the people, if we include women, if we include the slaves, were left out of the political decision making process. So it's important to look at democracy as a political system that, from its conception, has been evolving to encompass greater representation, greater political equality. And this can be seen by our current members of parliament. You've got a higher percentage of people of color. That was done through the vote. You've got women represented. That was done democratically through the vote, the voting system. And although you do have a elite sort of political class that was established, where you've got a lot of Oxbridge educated, privately educated, upper class men over the age of 30, represented in the House of Parliament, and most definitely in the House of Lords. It's important to remember that the evolutionary aspect of democracy. So Churchill famously said that democracy is the best system that we have. So it's the worst system apart from all the other systems that are available to us. So it's important when we think about later down the line the criticisms of democracy. It's important to remember that this is not meant to be a perfect system, but it's designed to be changing with with the times. Okay, so if we move on to a discussion on the types and examples of democracy, first we'll be looking at direct democracy, or sometimes called the Athenian model, or classical economy, or I've heard it being called pure economy. No, not not classical economy, classical democracy, and or a pure democracy. So direct, unmediated, continuous participation is what direct democracy is. So if there are 100 acts or white papers to be considered in a given day, the population will be able to vote on 100 acts without a go-between, without a member of parliament, um, as is the current system. So in Switzerland, in some provinces, you've got a very similar model to this, where there's regular referendums and the citizens vote regularly on these referendums. So you've got a very genuine democracy at play here. So that's a very poignant example of an advantage of this type of system. It fosters legitimacy, because if you've got 100 constituents and 99 of those 100 constituents have voted in the affirmative for a law, there's obviously a positive reaction to that law, and it thus becomes legitimate. So a disadvantage of this, a big disadvantage of this, if we just look at one advantage and one disadvantage, is that it's very costly. Currently, general elections are very costly because it involves a lot of bureaucracy. It involves a lot of wages being paid to people counting the votes, um, resources being allocated to closing down primary schools or public buildings, so the vote could take place. So it's very costly. That's something to consider with direct democracy as a disadvantage to that political system. So if we quickly go over a another example of a disadvantage here, is that the public lack expertise. So if, for instance, one of the acts is a minute detail about maritime law being changed, the average citizen may not have access to, or understanding of, or expertise of maritime law enough to make an informed decision. So that's a disadvantage of democracy that we'll later see when it comes to the Brexit referendum, for instance. Okay, so if we ignore this arrow here and focus on representative democracy, so that's what democracy looks like in the majority of Western countries today. So this is an indirect form of democracy where it's mediated and limits participation. People vote for and elect representatives. So that's why it's called representative democracy. Okay, so one advantage of this is that you gain a more educated representative. So usually very well educated individuals become members of parliament because they are seen to have a knowledge of the political system that that will be able to represent the people of their constituency um, to a greater extent. So it kind of limits some of the problems that we see with direct democracy. It's practical. So the individual doesn't need to spend a vast majority of their days essentially worrying about what laws are being passed because they've elected someone specifically for that role. So remember that those are the two main takeaway points there. Okay, so a disadvantage is that it creates an elitist class. So we were saying that there's a comparison between old Athenian model of democracy and how what democracy looked like in that age and today, because you've still got a higher class, over the age of 30, people represented in the House of Parliament. So it creates this political elite that can be viewed as a very major disadvantage. So we're going into 10 minutes now. Let's quickly go over a referendum, right? I would say for a homework, look into liberal democracy, um, which incorporates free and fair elections and place a very key importance on individual rights, right? So I would suggest that the student look at that as a type of democracy and study it in another time. So if you look at a referendum, right? So this is a form, an example of democracy at play. It's a form of direct democracy. So the people are given the ability to choose a to choose between between something that is being done. For example, in the Scottish referendum, people were able to choose between staying within the European Union, not the European Union, the United Kingdom, and or to leave the United Kingdom. If you look at the Brexit referendum or the European Union referendum, it was given the British public the chance to leave the European Union or stay within the Union. So one of the major problems with this, as we've seen, if we look at a disadvantage, is that the public may not be educated enough. And through political scheming, sometimes the public might be misinformed. So, for instance, with this was a very big criticism of the Brexit referendum because Remainers, people that wanted to remain within the European Union, were arguing that the public was misled and they did not have the sufficient educational knowledge, economical knowledge, to decide whether it would be beneficial for Britain to stay within the European Union or to leave it. It also might decrease the turnout if happened regularly. So here we can see that it's been happening more frequently since 1997. So referendums have been happening more frequently. So if, for instance, there were one referendum a year, by the fifth year you might see a drastic decrease in participation rates. Okay, so an advantage of referendum is, as we've said, with anything that is a direct democratic tool, like referendums, it garners a great deal of legitimacy. So, in the case of the Scottish referendum, the majority of Scots said we want to stay within the United Kingdom, and as a result of that, that gained a lot of legitimacy. It also proves that it is a genuine democracy. So so there's not this elitist system in the House of Parliament that is making all these decisions without the necessary consent on a big issue like like Britain staying or leaving the European, staying within or leaving the European Union. Okay, as we approach the finale of this lesson, I want you to think about some ways of tackling democratic crisis. So here I would give the student some chances to add their own ideas before going on to some of the other areas identified here. So one key feature is that democracy, as we know it now, um, is seeing reduced levels of participation. So these three ways. So one, whoops, lazy. So one, and then two, and then three ways are great. for increasing participation. So reducing the voting age